Imagine being judged for who you are before anyone even knows your name, then turning that judgment into triumph in a way no one could ignore. This is the story of Jonathan Brooks, a skilled black pilot mistaken for a passenger on a routine flight, only to step up and save the lives of everyone aboard when disaster struck. In this gripping tale of resilience, courage, and justice, you'll witness the raw emotions of humiliation, perseverance, and ultimate redemption. Stay with us as we uncover a journey that not only changed one flight, but challenged the biases we face every day. This is a story you won't forget. The airport bustled with life, a symphony of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and the faint crackle of announcements echoing through the terminal. Jonathan Brooks adjusted his leather flight jacket, his name stitched neatly above the heart, a subtle emblem of his expertise as a commercial airline pilot. He had just completed a grueling 14-hour transatlantic flight and was eager to relax on the short domestic trip home. Yet, even off duty, Jonathan couldn't escape the weight of his profession or the judgments it carried. As he approached the check-in counter, the agent barely looked up, her smile wavering when her eyes landed on him. "Coach or economy?" she asked briskly, her tone devoid of the warmth extended to the couple ahead of him. "First class," Jonathan replied evenly, sliding his ticket across the counter, her brows arched. "Flying for business?" "No," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just heading home." The agent's eyes flickered with something Jonathan had seen too often: disbelief mixed with mild suspicion. She hesitated before scanning his ticket, as though confirming its authenticity. When the beep confirmed it, her expression softened, but the moment lingered like an unpleasant aftertaste. Jonathan's shoulders tensed as he walked away, but he forced himself to breathe deeply. He knew better than to dwell on these moments. Yet, they cut all the same. For years, he had built an impeccable reputation in the cockpit, earning the respect of his peers. Outside the uniform, however, he was too often reduced to a stereotype. As he navigated the terminal, the hum of conversations around him seemed louder. A group of business people in suits eyed him curiously, their gazes lingering a second too long before turning away. He adjusted his carry-on bag, pretending not to notice, but their scrutiny felt like heat against his back. When Jonathan finally reached the gate, he settled into a chair near the window, gazing at the aircraft waiting on the tarmac. Flying had been his passion since childhood, a dream that had carried him through long nights of study and countless hurdles. The sky was the one place he felt free, far from the weight of assumptions and prejudice. On the ground, though, it was a different story. A child's laughter broke his thoughts. A little girl ran past him, her suitcase bouncing on tiny wheels. A mother, a young woman with kind eyes, offered Jonathan a brief smile as she chased after her daughter. It was a small moment, but it reminded him why he endured the indignities: to inspire a new generation who might one day see him not as an exception, but as the norm. The boarding announcement crackled through the speakers, pulling Jonathan from his reverie. He stood, squaring his shoulders. Another flight, another journey. He hoped this one would be uneventful, but he could never be sure. Jonathan approached the boarding line as passengers shuffled into formation, passports and tickets in hand. The gate agent, a wiry man with a sharp gaze, gave him a fleeting look of confusion before scanning his boarding pass. "First-class boarding is through the priority lane," the agent said, his tone bordering on curt. Jonathan nodded and motioned to the ticket in his hand. "I know. I'm in 2 Avad." The agent hesitated for a beat too long, his lips pressing into a thin line before he reluctantly waved Jonathan forward. As Jonathan stepped into the jet bridge, he could feel the stares on his back, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Does he really belong there? He reached the plane, where the flight attendants greeted him warmly. For a moment, the tension lifted. Jonathan offered a polite smile and made his way to the first-class cabin, stowing his bag in the overhead compartment. Settling into his seat, he adjusted the recliner and exhaled, letting the hum of the engines calm his nerves. The reprieve was short-lived. "Excuse me," came a voice from across the aisle. Jonathan turned to see an older man in a crisp navy blazer, his face etched with skepticism. "I think you might be in the wrong seat." Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. "No, I'm in the right seat too." The man's eyes narrowed, his doubt evident. "You sure about that?" "First class isn't open seating, you know?" Jonathan straightened, his voice steady but firm. "I'm well aware. My ticket confirms it." The man opened his mouth as if to argue, but the flight attendant intervened, stepping between them with a practiced smile. "Everything okay here?" she asked. The man hesitated before waving dismissively. "Just a mix-up, I'm sure." "No mix-up," Jonathan said quietly. "I know where I'm supposed to be." The flight attendant glanced at Jonathan, her smile faltering slightly, then at the man, whose expression suggested he dropped the matter for now. She moved on, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. Jonathan leaned back, pretending to study the in-flight safety card in front of him, but his mind churned. He could feel the sideward glances from the other passengers, the subtle weight of their assumptions pressing against him. The whispers were almost audible. Who is he? How did he get here? Minutes later, a woman in the row behind him tapped his shoulder. She was polite, but her words carried the same undertone. "Are you traveling with someone who works for the airline?" Jonathan looked at her, forcing a calm smile. "No, just heading home after a long trip." She blinked, taken aback. "Oh, I see." Her words were innocuous enough, but the implication wasn't lost on him. He turned away, staring out the window at the airport lights glowing against the twilight sky. His chest tightened as he recalled similar moments at hotels, in restaurants, and now on planes. No matter how many miles he logged or how many lives he carried safely from one destination to another, to some people, he would always be out of place. As the cabin filled and the pre-flight announcements began, Jonathan closed his eyes, centering himself. He thought of his mother's words when he first dreamed of becoming a pilot. "You'll have to work twice as hard to get half the respect. But you can do it." He had done it. He had flown planes across oceans, navigated storms, and earned accolades from his colleagues. Yet, here he was, his worth questioned by strangers who knew nothing of him beyond the color of his skin. The plane began to taxi, and Jonathan gripped the armrest, grounding himself. He had dealt with this before and would deal with it again. He had to, because the world didn't change unless people like him kept showing up, proving they belonged. Little did he know, the flight ahead would put that resolve to the ultimate test. The flight settled into a steady rhythm as the plane ascended into the darkening sky. The low hum of the engines and the faint clink of glasses in the first-class cabin provided a background to the hushed murmurs of conversation. Jonathan tried to relax, sipping his water and focusing on the clouds outside, but the unease in the air was palpable. It didn't take long for it to erupt. "Excuse me, stewardess," a voice cut through the cabin, sharp and demanding. Jonathan didn't need to turn around to know it was the man in the navy blazer. His tone carried the entitlement of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need to talk to someone about the seating arrangements." The flight attendant, a poised woman with years of experience handling difficult passengers, approached with a professional smile. "What seems to be the issue, sir?" The man gestured toward Jonathan with a subtle, almost conspiratorial motion. "I don't mean to cause trouble, but I think there's been a mistake. I've flown with this airline for years, and first class should be reserved for paying customers." Jonathan froze, his chest tightening. He had expected microaggressions, the kind of veiled comments he could brush off, but this was different. This was open hostility, dressed in the guise of concern. "I assure you, everyone in first class has a valid ticket," the flight attendant replied, her voice measured. "We verify this before boarding?" The man's jaw tightened. "I understand that, but maybe you could double-check? Just to make sure there's no mix-up. It would be better to resolve it now than later." The flight attendant glanced at Jonathan, her cheeks coloring slightly. "There's no need, sir. Everything is in order." Unsatisfied, the man turned directly to Jonathan. "Do you work for the airline? Is that how you got here?" Jonathan set his glass down carefully, his hand steady despite the simmering anger beneath the surface. He met the man's gaze, his voice calm but resolute. "No, I'm here on a paid ticket, just like you." The man scoffed, leaning back in his seat. "Funny, I've never seen someone like you in this section before." A silence fell over the cabin, heavy and oppressive. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending not to listen, others openly watching the exchange. Jonathan could feel the weight of their gazes, their curiosity mingled with unease. "Is there a problem with me being here?" Jonathan asked, his voice firmer now. The man waved a dismissive hand. "No problem, just unusual, that's all." Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but the flight attendant interrupted. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remain seated and refrain from further comments. If you have concerns, you can address them to the airline after the flight." The man muttered something under his breath, but he sank into his seat, his posture stiff with indignation. The flight attendant offered Jonathan an apologetic glance before walking away. Jonathan tried to return to his book, but the tension lingered. The air felt thick, every sound amplified, the rustle of pages, the clink of ice in glasses, the faint buzz of conversation. He could feel the unspoken judgment around him, a silent verdict passed by people who didn't know him but thought they did. Minutes later, another voice shattered his fragile attempt at calm. "You a football player?" It was the man behind him this time, leaning forward in his seat. "Or maybe basketball?" Jonathan turned slowly, forcing a neutral expression. "No, I'm a pilot." The man blinked, his face a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "You're a pilot?" "Yes," Jonathan replied, his tone clipped. "For this airline?" The man pressed, his incredulity clear. "No, not for this airline," Jonathan said. "But I've been a commercial pilot for over a decade." The man's eyebrows shot up. "Huh, that's impressive." The word hung in the air, laced with condescension. Jonathan could feel his patience wearing thin. He wanted to lash out, to demand why his presence, his mere existence, required justification. But he knew better. He had learned long ago that anger, no matter how justified, would only confirm the stereotypes others projected onto him. Instead, he turned back to his book, willing the conversation to end. Yet the questions and whispers persisted, each one a tiny needle pricking at his resolve. "Why do I always have to explain myself?" he thought, the words echoing in his mind. "Why do I always have to prove that I belong?" His mother's voice came to him again, a memory from years ago. "Jonathan, the world isn't always fair, but if you know who you are, no one can take that away from you." He held on to those words like a lifeline, breathing deeply as he refocused on the pages in front of him. Still, the sting of humiliation lingered, the indignity of being doubted in a space he had every right to occupy. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the flight's cruising altitude and the expected arrival time. Jonathan glanced at his watch, counting down the hours until the flight would be over. Little did he know, the real test of his strength and skill was just beginning. The flight was uneventful for the first hour. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, trying to lose himself in a novel, though his mind replayed the earlier confrontation. Despite his calm exterior, the sting of humiliation lingered. His mother's words about resilience echoed in his head, that they felt hollow in the face of yet another battle for basic respect. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight crew began meal service. Trays clinked, and a low murmur of conversation filled the air. Jonathan focused on his breathing, letting the rhythmic hum of the engines soothe him. But the peace was shattered moments later. A sudden, jarring vibration coursed through the plane, accompanied by a loud metallic thunk. Passengers gasped, their heads snapping toward the windows and ceiling as if seeking answers from the air itself. Jonathan sat upright, his pilot instincts activating instantly. He scanned the cabin, from the way the attendants exchanged tense glances and moved briskly to secure loose items. It was clear something was wrong. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, clipped and tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing an unexpected mechanical issue. Please remain calm and seated with your seatbelts fastened. The crew will keep you updated." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Mechanical issue. He knew those words could mean anything from a minor glitch to a catastrophic failure. He watched as the passengers exchanged frightened whispers, their anxiety rippling through the cabin like a wave. He could feel it too, the subtle drop in altitude, the faint unevenness in the engine's hum. The attendants hurried to calm the passengers, but their forced smiles did little to ease the growing tension. Jonathan's years of experience told him the situation was escalating. Then came another jolt, more violent this time, sending drinks and trays spilling to the floor. The cabin filled with cries of alarm, and even the attendants looked momentarily shaken. The plane began to tilt, the nose dipping slightly as turbulence compounded the chaos. Jonathan unbuckled his seatbelt. A flight attendant immediately approached, her face a mask of controlled panic. "Sir, I need you to stay seated. I'm a commercial pilot," Jonathan interrupted, his tone firm but calm. "What's the situation?" The attendant hesitated, scanning his face as if weighing his claim. Another jolt rocked the plane, making the decision for her. She gestured for him to follow and led him quickly toward the cockpit. As they reached the door, she pressed a code into the panel, and it swung open. Inside, the cockpit was a storm of flashing lights and alarms. The captain and first officer were locked in intense conversation, their faces pale with concentration. "Who's this?" the captain demanded, his tone edged with frustration as he glanced at Jonathan. "Jonathan Brooks," he replied. "I'm a commercial pilot. I can help." The captain hesitated for only a second before nodding sharply. "We've lost hydraulic pressure in one of the main systems. Autopilot's unreliable, and we're struggling to stabilize the plane. The rudder's sluggish, and our descent is uneven." Jonathan slipped into the jump seat and studied the instruments. The situation was worse than he'd feared. The altimeter showed a steady loss of altitude, and the control surfaces were clearly compromised. Without hydraulic support, steering the massive aircraft was like trying to guide a ship with a broken rudder in a storm. "Where's the nearest divert airport?" Jonathan asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Midway, but we're still 200 miles out," the first officer replied. Jonathan's mind raced. They needed to act fast. He assessed the situation quickly, drawing on years of training. "We need to reduce speed to minimize stress on the airframe. Switch to manual controls entirely, and I'll assist with the trim adjustments." The captain glanced at him, then nodded. "Fine, let's do it." Jonathan's hands moved instinctively, working in sync with the other pilots. He adjusted the trim, stabilizing the pitch as much as possible. The controls were heavy, requiring immense physical effort to maneuver, but they began to regain some semblance of control. Back in the cabin, the passengers were in a near panic. Oxygen masks dangled from the ceiling, and the attendants struggled to maintain order. The man in the navy blazer sat rigid, his face pale as he gripped the armrests. Across the aisle, a mother clutched her crying child, murmuring reassurances that seemed more for herself than the little one. Jonathan's voice was calm as he relayed instructions to the crew. "We need to start our descent now. Let's prepare for a rough landing." The first officer nodded and began coordinating with air traffic control. Jonathan could hear snippets of the conversation through the headset. Emergency clearance, runway preparation, and medical teams on standby. The plane trembled as it began its descent, the groan of the airframe underscoring the precariousness of their situation. Jonathan's focus remained laser-sharp, his mind a blur of calculations and decisions. Minutes felt like hours as the ground drew closer. The landing would be critical. Any misstep could mean disaster. Jonathan's hands tightened on the controls, his voice steady as he directed the team. "Deploy the landing gear manually. Use gravity drop if necessary. The captain complied, and the satisfying thud of the gear locking into place was a small victory amid the chaos. The runway lights came into view, a beacon of hope through the darkness. Jonathan spoke evenly. "Prepare for reverse thrust and full brake application on touchdown. It's going to be rough, but we'll make it." The plane screamed as it hit the runway, the tires skidding against the asphalt. Passengers cried out, the cabin rattling violently as the pilots worked to bring the aircraft to a halt. Jonathan's muscles strained against the controls, his breath shallow but controlled. Finally, the plane slowed, rolling to an unsteady stop at the end of the runway. For a moment, there was silence thick and heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. Then came the applause. It started with one passenger and quickly spread, a wave of relief and gratitude washing over the cabin. But Jonathan barely noticed. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned back in the jump seat, the enormity of the moment sinking in. "Nice work," the captain said quietly, his expression one of genuine respect. Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. "Just doing my job." He glanced at the passengers through the cockpit door. Many were still crying, others clutching one another as if to reaffirm their survival. Among them, Jonathan spotted the man in the navy blazer, his eyes wide with disbelief. For once, Jonathan didn't feel the need to say anything. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. The cabin was in stunned silence as the plane finally came to a stop at the end of the runway. The faint smell of burnt rubber lingered in the air, a testament to the violent emergency landing they had just endured. The passengers were alive, unharmed, and safe, but only because of Jonathan Brooks. Jonathan took a moment to steady his breath, still seated in the cockpit. His hands trembled slightly from the physical strain of maneuvering the damaged aircraft, but his mind remained sharp. He exchanged a nod with the captain and first officer, their expressions filled with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "I don't know how we would have managed without you," the captain said, his voice low. "You didn't just save the passengers, you saved all of us." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. He glanced back into the cabin, where the flight attendants worked to calm the passengers and assess for injuries. "We did it together," he said finally, his humility genuine. Emergency vehicles rushed toward the aircraft, their flashing lights illuminating the night like a beacon. The faint sound of sirens echoed through the cabin, signaling the arrival of first responders. Over the intercom, the captain spoke to the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've made an emergency landing. Please remain seated as we coordinate with emergency crews to ensure everyone disembarks safely. On behalf of myself, the crew, and everyone aboard, I want to thank you for your patience and bravery." A murmur of relief rippled through the cabin. Some passengers broke into quiet sobs, the weight of the ordeal finally catching up with them. Others sat frozen in their seats, staring blankly ahead as if unable to process what had just happened. Jonathan stepped out of the cockpit, his presence drawing immediate attention. Conversations halted, and every pair of eyes in the first-class cabin turned toward him. The passengers stared at him, their earlier judgment and skepticism replaced with something different. "Ah, was it you?" a woman asked, her voice trembling. She was clutching her young daughter tightly, her face pale, but her eyes bright with gratitude. Jonathan nodded. "I assisted the flight crew. It was a team effort." The murmurs began again, but this time they carried a different tone. Words like pilot, hero, and saved us floated through the air. The man in the navy blazer sat in stunned silence, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Jonathan's calm demeanor never wavered as he made his way down the aisle, assisting passengers who were visibly shaken. A woman gripped his arm as he passed. "Thank you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought we weren't going to make it." "You're safe now," Jonathan replied softly, giving her a reassuring nod. As emergency crews boarded the plane, directing passengers to evacuate through the emergency slides, Jonathan stayed behind, ensuring no one was left behind. He moved with quiet authority, his training guiding every step. Even the flight attendants deferred to him, their earlier skepticism replaced with trust. When the cabin was empty and all passengers accounted for, Jonathan finally descended the slide, stepping onto the tarmac. A gust of cool night air hit his face, grounding him after the intensity of the past hour. Around him, passengers huddled in groups, wrapped in emergency blankets and speaking to first responders. The glow of the airport's floodlights illuminated the scene, casting long shadows across the tarmac. One by one, passengers began approaching him. Some offered tearful thanks, others reached out to shake his hand. Even those who had remained silent on the flight now felt compelled to speak. "You saved my family," said a man clutching the hand of his pregnant wife. "I don't know how to thank you." Jonathan gave a small smile. "I'm just glad you're all okay." The man in the navy blazer lingered at a distance, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. I was wrong about you," he said, his voice subdued. "I'm sorry for the way I acted earlier." "I didn't." Jonathan raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "You don't need to explain. What matters is that everyone's safe." The man nodded, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and respect. "Thank you." Truly. Nearby, a journalist who had been among the passengers approached, camera in hand. "Excuse me, are you the pilot who saved us? I'd like to get your story." Jonathan hesitated. The spotlight wasn't something he sought. He'd always preferred the quiet satisfaction of doing his job well. But this wasn't just about him. It was about challenging the biases and assumptions that had dogged him his entire career. "I assisted the crew," he said carefully, his voice measured. "It was a team effort, and the priority was getting everyone here safely." The journalist pressed on. "But you stepped in when the situation called for it. You took charge. That's heroic." Jonathan sighed softly, but nodded. "If this helps people understand what we're capable of, what anyone is capable of, then I'm happy to share." The journalist's camera captured the moment as Jonathan spoke, his words resonating with everyone who had witnessed his actions. Passengers watched from the sidelines, their expressions a mix of admiration and humility. For Jonathan, this was more than just a moment of triumph. It was an opportunity to shift the narrative, to show that competence and character weren't bound by the limits of prejudice. His actions had spoken louder than the whispers, the doubts, and the sideways glances. Tonight, he had proven that he belonged not just in the cockpit, but in any space he chose to occupy. As the passengers were escorted to safety and the emergency crews began their investigation, Jonathan stood quietly on the tarmac. The weight of the evening settled over him, but so did a quiet pride. He had done what he was trained to do, but more importantly, he had done it with dignity. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen not as a symbol, but as a man. The terminal was alive with a cacophony of emotions as the passengers filed into the holding area, greeted by the warmth of airport staff and emergency responders. Some sobbed with relief, clutching loved ones tightly, while others sat quietly, staring into the distance, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. Yet amidst the chaos, a shared sentiment began to ripple through the crowd: gratitude. Jonathan stood to the side, his silhouette framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac. The remnants of the plane sat illuminated by the cold blue lights of emergency vehicles, a stark reminder of how close the passengers had come to disaster. He stayed back, allowing the passengers to process the moment without drawing attention to himself. But attention found him anyway. The first to approach was the mother with her young daughter. The child held tightly to a stuffed bear, her tear-streaked face buried in her mother's side. The woman hesitated, her hands twisting nervously before she stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks," she began, her voice shaking. I don't even know what to say. You saved my little girl's life. Our lives. Thank you doesn't seem like enough." Jonathan offered a soft smile and crouched to the child's level. "You were very brave up there," he said gently, his voice steady and kind. You held on tight, didn't you? The girl nodded, her grip tightening on the bear. I was scared, she admitted. Being scared is okay, Jonathan said. What matters is that you're safe now. The mother's eyes brimmed with tears as she placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. You're a hero, she said. Don't let anyone ever make you feel otherwise. As the woman and her child moved away, more passengers began to approach, each with their own words of thanks. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices laden with emotion. Some apologized for the way they had judged him. Others simply expressed their awe at his composure and skill. The man in the navy blazer was among them. He lingered at the edge of the crowd, his face flushed with embarrassment. After several false starts, he finally stepped forward. Captain Brooks, he said, his voice hesitant but earnest. Jonathan straightened, meeting the man's gaze. Just Jonathan, he replied. The man rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Jonathan, I owe you an apology. I was wrong. I judged you, and I had no right. You proved me and everyone else completely wrong. I don't know how to thank you. Jonathan regarded him for a long moment before speaking. You don't owe me thanks, he said evenly. But maybe think about why you assumed what you did. That's the only way things get better. The man nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly. I will, he said quietly. I promise. Nearby, the journalist who had spoken to Jonathan earlier began taking notes as passengers shared their accounts. Each one emphasized the same point. Jonathan's skill and leadership had saved them all. The story was already becoming a narrative of redemption, not just for the passengers who had doubted him, but for what Jonathan represented. The captain and first officer approached, their faces etched with gratitude. We've been debriefed, the captain said. The airline wants to speak with you about what happened. They're already hearing from passengers, and I wouldn't be surprised if this turns into something big. Jonathan nodded, his face calm but thoughtful. He didn't relish the idea of fame, but he understood the importance of what had happened. This wasn't just about him. It was about challenging the biases that had shaped so many of his experiences, both in the cockpit and on the ground. As the crowd began to disperse, Jonathan felt a light tap on his shoulder. It was the woman from the flight crew who had first doubted him when he'd offered to help. Her face was flushed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I wanted to say I'm sorry, she said quickly, the words tumbling out. When you said you were a pilot, I didn't believe you. And I should have. I should have trusted you. Jonathan's expression softened. You did trust me, he said, when it mattered most. She blinked, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered before walking away. Jonathan glanced around the terminal, watching as passengers reunited with loved ones or quietly reflected on the night's events. He felt the weight of the moment, the validation, the responsibility, the chance to be a part of something larger than himself. It wasn't just about the lives he'd saved. It was about changing the way people saw others like him. One flight, one interaction, one act of courage at a time. As the terminal quieted, Jonathan found himself alone at a corner window, gazing out at the airfield. The flashing lights of emergency vehicles had dimmed, and the sleek body of the plane, damaged but intact, stood as a silent testament to the night's events. He thought about the judgments he had faced, not just on this flight, but throughout his career and life. The quiet disbelief, the veiled questions, the outright challenges to his abilities. Tonight had been no different, but it had also been transformative. Jonathan's mind replayed the faces of the passengers, the fear that had melted into gratitude, the apologies laced with regret, and the hesitant but sincere acknowledgments of their own biases. It was progress, he realized, but it was just a beginning. He drew a deep breath, grounding himself in the present. I don't do this for recognition, he thought. I do it because it's who I am. But this moment wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel invisible. He hoped his actions tonight would ripple outward, inspiring conversations, challenging assumptions, and creating change. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on its message. Racial bias and prejudice often operate quietly, shaping interactions in ways that can harm, exclude, and diminish. But courage and competence can challenge those assumptions and change minds. Jonathan Brooks reminded us all of the power of perseverance, dignity, and skill in the face of judgment. Let his story inspire us to see beyond stereotypes and embrace a world of equality and respect. If you believe in spreading this message, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Let's work together to make stories like this the norm, not the exception.